Well, it is 7:06, so I think we're going to get started here. So I'm just going to start off with a bit of an introduction to our series here. So this series that we've been doing has been put on by um, Healthy Waters Lac La Biche, which was formerly known as, well, and still is, the Lac La Biche Region Watershed Stewardship Society. So I'm glad that everyone has been able to join us today. Oh, I just got one more person joining us here. So I just wanted to, before we get too far into it, remind everybody that we are going to be having two more sessions after this one. So the first one that we're going to be having next is going to be on September 3rd. And this is going to be done by Nathan Ballard of Alberta Environment and Parks, and he's going to be giving us an overview of the scientific studies that have been done on Lac La Biche and what that tells us about managing water quality. So really looking forward to that one. You can get more info on that as well as the other ones on our Facebook page. The other one, oh, sorry, I'm wrong. We have three more. And then the next one after that will be on September 17th. So Nathan Ballard's will be on September 3rd. Next one after that will be September 17th, and that's on planning for healthy lakes, talking about decision-making processes. And so that's going to be really eye-opening for those, especially that are involved in politics, on how we do proper planning. And then on October the 1st, I will be giving a talk on wetlands and how do we identify what wetlands are, because a lot of times we overlook wetlands. We don't understand where wetlands are. And so we'll talk about how they're important and how we recognize them on the landscape, because a lot of times, yeah, a lot of people don't know what an area is, if it's a wetland or not. So that's our series. I'm really proud to have such a great lineup that we've been able to put together. The next thing I wanted to just review with everyone is how to use the Zoom functions that we're going to be using today. So right at the bottom of your screen, of the Zoom window, you should be able to see a few different options there. I would encourage you guys to be using the chat feature if you want to ask questions during the presentation. So that is the little speech bubble type icon. So I would encourage you to have that perhaps open on the side. If you open that up, I'm going to be monitoring that. And then when there are opportune times in the presentation for those questions to be answered, then we'll make sure that we do that. So you can type in there anytime, and then we'll answer those questions when it's a convenient time for us to do that. You can also, if you think something's really cool, there's the reactions there on the bottom. So you can give a thumbs up or a clap thing if you are excited about what's going on. If you have a good internet connection, I would encourage you to use your video on your screen. I find when I'm giving a webinar that it's really nice for me to be able to see the people and be able to see who's people that are excited about things and that sort of thing. Yeah, if you don't have a great connection, then perhaps you don't want to use that to use up too much bandwidth. I will be giving a couple of polls, so I want to encourage everyone to be participating in those polls as we go through. And so you'll see a poll popping up on the screen, and sometimes you'll only be able to pick one option, and sometimes you can pick multiple options, and it'll show that up for you on there. Would encourage everyone to keep yourself muted during the presentation. Just helps with not having feedback and accidental, toilet flushes or whatever. Would encourage you guys, yes, just to keep yourself muted. If you want to unmute yourself during the when we have a Q&A session towards the end, you can just easily do that using your space bar on most computers. Otherwise, you can just hover over your picture on, depending on the view that you've got selected. On the top corner, you can select to have a speaker view or a gallery view. So I prefer the speaker view myself, but if you hover over your picture, then you will see the little blue mute button there. So would encourage you guys to keep that on there for now. So I think that's the basics of the background stuff I wanted to make sure we covered. So I'm just going to now introduce our speaker. So Janine is a education and engagement specialist with Alberta Environment and Parks. And I'm gonna ask her, so what does an engagement and education specialist at Alberta Environment and Parks do? Janine?
Great question, Michael. Well, first of all, we changed the name of our job quite often. So we used to be called Community Engagement Leads, but we recently changed it to Engagement and Education Specialist. So my role essentially is to run some of our education programs that we have in Alberta Environment and Parks. So currently I focus my time on aquatic invasive species, the Respect Our Lakes program, water literacy, and now fish education as well.
Ooh.
So
Your job is getting more fishy.
Always, always. It all fits together well, though, so it works out.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Janine, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, and thanks, Michael, for inviting me to come and speak. It's always really exciting when we get to come and share some of the work that we do with groups, because especially right now in the unprecedented times that we're in, spending a lot of time at home and a lot of time not necessarily out interacting with the public, which is where we prefer to be as much as possible. So just before I get started, I just want to respectfully acknowledge that I'm in Edmonton right now, so I'm currently on Treaty 6 territory, and I acknowledge the many First Nations and Métis whose footsteps have marked these lands for centuries. I honor and respect the elders of the past, present, and the future. So knowing that people, I think, are probably joining us from a few different areas tonight, I just ask that you take some time to acknowledge the Indigenous people of your region before we get started. So in terms of where we're headed tonight, we're going to talk about lakes in Alberta. So what type of lakes do we have here, and why do we have them here, and all that fun stuff. And then we'll talk a little bit more about lake stewardship, focusing in sort of 3 different categories. So in the watershed, on the shoreline, and then in the water. So more of the recreation focus. So that being said, as mentioned, I'm an education and engagement specialist, so I'm not a limnologist. So I'll get you to save all your really tough lake questions for Nathan when he comes and presents for you, and all your tough planning questions for Erin when she comes and presents for you. But if you have any questions at all, like Michael said, please type them into the chat. And if I don't know the answer, then we'll find it out for you after the fact. So we'll take a break in between sort of the 2 sections to answer questions, and then we can kind of go from there. So first off, before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick poll to see where you actually live. So often when we're doing presentations at conferences, you have the ability to ask people where they're coming from. Are they a waterfront owner? So Michael's put the poll up there. So if you want to go ahead and select an answer in terms of what best describes your living situation, that'll help form sort of the rest of our presentation and where we focus our efforts on. And so once people have selected their options, then Michael will close the poll and then share the results so we can see where everybody's coming from.
Yeah, and just know that these polls are time limited, so make sure you get your response in.
All right, how are we doing for responses?
We got 11 people, and I can't vote. I'm not allowed. Yeah, somebody asks, would our urban center be considered a lakeside subdivision? I would say probably our urban center in Lac-La-Biche would be near a lake, but not in a lakeside subdivision. That's what I would do. But. All right. So I'll give it 10 more seconds. Oh yes, and thank you, Brian. I was going to pipe in there, but I didn't actually. I'm so bad at remembering numbers, so I wasn't going to pretend I remembered which treaty. So yes, we are in Treaty 6 territory ourselves, and close to the boundary of Treaty 8 territory. We want to acknowledge our First Nations here as well. All
Perfect.
right,
Thanks,
so
Brian.
I think we're done. We have a bunch of people in either urban centers, lakeside subdivisions, or along the shoreline. Yeah, looks like. All right,
Perfect. Did you want to share the results from that poll?
oh yeah, that's right. We're going to end that poll, and there we go, share the results.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so it looks like, yeah, we've got people kind of coming from all across the board, which is great. Some lucky people who live along the shoreline of the lake, always the most sought after.
All right.
Excellent. All right, so we'll move on to talk a little bit more about lakes in Alberta. So before we start talking about this, one thing that we always like to talk a little bit more just about where is our water coming from in Alberta. So this is something that we've really seen, especially over the past few years with some of the water literacy work that we're doing, is that people don't know where their water goes and where their water comes from. And so here in Alberta, we're lucky to have 7 major watersheds. And in case you happen to forget what a watershed is, that's just an area of land where all the water drains into a common location. So watersheds can be referred to in a couple of different ways. Some people call them drainage basins or watersheds, and that kind of depends on the size of them. But the important thing to remember about watersheds is that there's always a watershed within a watershed within a watershed. So depending on where you're looking, some of them are really big and some of them are really small. So I like to think of watersheds as Russian stacking dolls. If you've seen these before, I remember them from my childhood, always playing with them, but one fits inside of the other. And so we, like I said, always have different size watersheds. So when we're talking about watershed health, this can be a really, really big thing that we're talking about, or it can be a more localized thing that we're talking about. And so in terms of types of watersheds that we have in Alberta, we actually have 2 different types. One of which is a mountain-fed watershed. And so that's essentially water that's coming down from glacier ice melt and precipitation. So these are going to be the ones that are all along the mountains. And so the other watershed that we have that lots of people don't actually necessarily know about is a prairie-fed watershed. And so these ones, of course, are going to be in the prairies based on their name. And so it's fed from precipitation and snowpack melt. So the Brevo River watershed and the Battle River watershed are 2 examples of those. And so when we're looking again at watersheds, the type of watershed matters, and then also the size that we're actually looking at. So when we start to dive in a little bit closer to look at the lake watershed, this is where it really comes down to lake health. And so when we're talking about having a healthy watershed, we're really talking about that area of land where all of the water drains into the lake. And so when we're doing planning efforts and things like that, you may have seen this map before, which I stole from one of your guys' reports. This is essentially the Lac La Biche Lake watershed area. So all of this land that you can see outlined here, all of the water is draining down into the Lac La Biche Lake, which means that all of the activities within that watershed that are happening can have an impact on lake health. So it's not just the shoreline that we need to be focusing on. We can be taking a more broader approach. And that's really the shift that Alberta Environment and Parks has been taking over the past few years. So in terms of where our lakes actually are in Alberta, we do have lots of lakes that are here. However, there are lots of different types of lakes. And so it's important to remember that not all lakes are the same, especially when we're talking about recreational lakes. So we don't have that many lakes that are what people are looking for when it comes to a recreational lake, where they want to make sure that it's really great to meet all of their different needs that they're looking for. But the other thing to keep in mind is that of the few good recreational lakes that we have, they're quite close to urban centers. And so what that means is that we end up getting a lot of use on those lakes because lots of people love to go to the lake, which is really great and exciting because I love going to the lake. I think you all love going to the lake. That's why you're here tonight. But it just also plays into factors in terms of how much use our lakes are actually getting. And so again, it's just really important to remember that not all lakes are the same. And so in Alberta, we have a really broad diversity of lakes, ranging from the high alpine mountain lakes down to the lakes that are in the prairie soil. So we've been really lucky here in Alberta to be blessed with great farming soil. But what that means for a lot of our prairie lakes is that they naturally have a lot of nutrients in them to begin with. So believe it or not, this kayaking picture is on a lake. It's on Lake Isle, so just outside of Edmonton here. Not a wetland, although it pretty much looks like a wetland. But major differences in what we're looking at between these two lakes, but they also have really different characteristics. So one of the things that can be difficult when we're talking about lake health is that when people see the photo on the right, they may think that it's unhealthy because it is a very productive lake. But for that lake itself, that might be actually completely normal and what we're used to seeing. So in terms of who's actually using lakes, we know that our population in Alberta is growing, and it's projected to continue to grow. And so again, if we've got people moving into the urban centers and accessing those lakes that are 2 hours away, it's something that we need to keep in mind in terms of lake health and also what we're planning for essentially in the future. So in 2019, we saw that we had 251,000 angling licenses, for example. So this is a really good number essentially that we can use to see how many people are fishing. And it's not to say that they're fishing just at lakes, but because of the way that our lakes are, that actually means that we have over 250 people fishing per lake at the fish-bearing lakes. And so when we compare this to other provinces, places like Manitoba end up usually having about 3 anglers per lake. So huge fishing pressure here in Alberta. So we have to manage our fisheries a little bit different. And again, it just has implications in terms of the health of our lake. So another thing that we can look at is where people are buying property. And so this year especially, we'll talk about the use a little bit. That's changed this year. But a RE/MAX report in 2018 actually pointed out that it's more common now for people to purchase property in Canada and in Alberta, in the prairies, as secondary homes along lakes, with the most popular being cabins and waterfront properties. So rather than buying a second property down in the States and snowbirding, people are spending their money for properties that are a little bit closer to home. So again, when that comes to lake use, that means that we're going to have more people who are sticking around and visiting our beautiful lakes here in Alberta. So we'll launch the next poll here as well, to just talk about what your experience has been this year with lakes. So we know, again, that we're in completely unprecedented times. The world has been turned upside down. And so essentially what that means is we're seeing a lot of use. And so I'd like to just know if you guys have had the chance to visit your lake more or less this year because of that. And then what some of your most common activities are at the lake. And so you can actually choose more than one option for your common activities at the lake.
And I'll just remind people that you may need to scroll down a little bit to see all of the options.
All right, how are we doing for numbers, Michael? Oh, you're muted right now.
Sorry about that. Yeah, we're going to cut it off in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, and pull here and share results. There you go.
Perfect. So yeah, about almost 50% of people have been able to visit the lake more this year, 25% less and 25% about the same. Relaxing, that's my favorite thing to do at the lake too. Love that. Yeah, lots of people boating, not so many fishing, wildlife watching, swimming. Perfect. Glad to see that there's nobody here that says that they don't go to the lake. All right. So if anybody has any questions, we can just stop and take a quick break here before we move on to the lake stewardship part. I see that Jamie says interesting to hear the comparison of fishermen to other provinces. So it is definitely something that makes it unique here in Alberta. And something interesting too in terms of use this year is that we've actually sold more fishing licenses this year than we ever have before. So this year alone, we've seen increased numbers, and we're actually on track to sell the most licenses that we've ever sold in terms of fishing. So definitely seeing that increased use. If you guys have seen the news, especially out on Crown land, there's been a lot of use out there, and some issues with garbage and things like that, because we've just got so many more people going out onto the landscape, and people who don't necessarily maybe take advantage of that as well. So as the world changes, we have to change and adapt as well. All right, so we'll carry on. And if there's any questions, yeah, we'll have lots of time at the end for questions as well. So talking about lake stewardship, so basically what can we do to help the health of our lake? And so something that's always really interesting to me around lakes when we're talking to people is that there's always things that essentially everybody can do as we go along. And so it's everybody's responsibility to take these small actions. It's not necessarily that we're pointing fingers at one person or the other to do it, which is a common thing at lakes because it can be really hard when there's so many tiny factors that are playing into our lake health. But I think that's another interesting thing that has come out of the COVID pandemic is that we are seeing changes in the world that have resulted from people's actions, right? So in terms of air quality, especially, we've seen massive air quality changes from places where people are no longer driving places. So I think it's a good reminder to really push people to take action and that these small actions that you can take really do have an impact. So I often like to think of it as well as your fingerprint. So we have a footprint, but what is our fingerprint? So what is the small things that we're doing that will help the health of the lake as we go forward? So in this next part, we're going to split it up into 3 sections. So we're going to talk about essentially stewardship in the watershed, stewardship in the water, so that'll be the recreation part that we go to last, and then stewardship on the shoreline as well. And so what I want to do is just talk about some of the activities that have impacts on our lakes and what we can do to help mitigate them as well. And so we know, again, that everything that happens in the lake watershed can have an impact on the lake. And so again, we can all take action in order to help. So in the watershed, this can be the trickiest one because people who live within the lake watershed might not necessarily be aware that they actually live within the lake watershed. So when we saw that map, you know, depending on the lake and the specifics around it, that watershed can actually be quite large. So even though you don't live right beside the lake, you can still have an impact on it. And so as people come along, you know, they're really excited, they've got their property, and they're all set and ready to go. They might not be thinking as with the lake sort of at the forefront of their mind if they're not there. So in terms of activities that happen in the watershed, of course we have development, which can be industrial, which can be municipal, which can just be people putting up houses, acreages, any of that stuff. And then we've also got agricultural activity as well. So we always have to remember recreation is another activity too. So even though it might not be directly beside the lake, it can still be having an impact on the lake. So in terms of what some of the things are that we see because of these activities from humans that love to go and spend time around the lake, is that quite often our natural vegetation is removed. And so that of course just comes with development. So as we're building roads and putting up driveways and things like that, we're cutting down our natural vegetation and then we're putting in these impermeable surfaces. So things like pavement that water is going to be rolling off of very quickly and not necessarily having the time to slow down and soak into the ground, which Michael will talk a lot about with wetlands in his presentation, I'm sure. But we also have an issue with nutrient loading. So whether it's somebody who's fertilizing their grass or whether it's from agricultural activity, we've got nutrients coming into the watershed from all different areas. And so what that means for our lakes, which are already naturally fairly productive and have lots of nutrients on their own, is that they're just getting overloaded essentially with these nutrients. And then we also have the issue of tributary damage. So there's lots of really interesting work that's coming out right now in terms of riparian area assessments. And so there's the project that's sort of right on the verge right now. It's not quite public yet. They're just working on putting the final touches on it, but the Battle River Watershed and the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliances have worked together to build a new riparian web portal. So I'll flag that for you guys to keep an eye out for it, but essentially what it does is it's bringing 3 different assessment methods into one location so that you can look at watershed health. And so what it does is it combines all of the data from the 3 different assessments, which is cows and fish, which is the on-the-ground assessment, drone or aerial, so using helicopters, or lastly satellite, which is the newest technology that people are using in terms of riparian intactness. So it's a little tricky to explain because there's intactness and there's health and they're not the same thing. But ultimately, we need to make sure that we have healthy riparian areas in all of our tributaries that are leading into the lake and to ensure our lake health going forward. So in terms of stewardship actions that we can take, in order to help mitigate some of these issues that we're seeing because of our activity in the watershed, is really just to think about how can we slow that water down. So what can we do to slow the water down and get it back into the ground where it can get back to sort of its natural processes. So rain gardens are a really great thing that you can build, and our friends at the ALIDP, which is the Alberta Low Impact Development Plan or Program, acronyms are always so hard, but they have put together a really great guide on how to make rain gardens, and they can come out and help you build one yourself. But the purpose of a rain garden really, like I said, is just to slow that water down and redirect it, and making sure that you're planting all these native plants in your rain garden. And ultimately, we would like to see reduced impermeable surfaces. So people who are building these big, long paved driveways, does it really need to be pavement, or can it be something else? Or what can we look at in terms of development going forward? Because again, the more the water runs off of it, it's just going to pick up more nutrients and make its way down to the lake sooner than what we would like to see. So of course, then we also have the issue of fertilizers. And so this is a common thing that lots of lake communities have taken action on and put in bylaws saying that you can't fertilize your lawn, which is really great because, again, so many of our lakes are already naturally eutrophic and have so many nutrients on their own, they do not need any more from us. So if you are using fertilizer, it's the best method to use organic or slow release fertilizers. And then of course, we just want to make sure that we're leaving as many trees and shrubs as possible. So the more native vegetation that we can have, the better. And so if it's blocking your view, can you prune it rather than remove it? What can you do in order to keep that intact, basically? And then if you are in an area that has been disturbed, making sure that what you're planting is actually native. So it'll save you money in the end if it's native, because chances are it'll survive and do a lot better than if you're planting other species, and will be better for the local bees and everything like that that are around as well. So another big one is agriculture. And so with agriculture, we really want to make sure that we're following best practices. And so Cows and Fish, again, a great organization that has lots of stuff out there that's going on in terms of helping out our agricultural producers to get their cows essentially out of the water. And so there's been some great studies that have been done that have shown that by providing clean water for your cattle, they actually gain more weight. So not only is it better for the producer, but it's also better for the lake as well. And so this also counts for tributaries. Pretty much the last thing that we want to see is cows walking in the water. So we want to be able to either fence them off, provide them with that alternative water source. If they have the alternative water source, chances are they're going to go and drink from it. So the other thing as well in terms of our agricultural crowd out there is to make sure that we're using the 4R stewardship principles when you're applying any nutrients, basically. And so these principles basically is the right source, the right time, the right rate, and the right place. So you just want to make sure that you're using the right type of fertilizer and that you're not putting too much on that it will just wash off the land, essentially. So again, it's kind of finding the things that benefit both the agricultural producer and the watershed health itself. And so when we talk about this, it's really about finding, again, that sort of meeting point where if you're putting down fertilizer, you don't want to pay for extra fertilizer. So we want to make sure that it's going out at the right rate. So in terms of our recreation, this is a big issue, especially up in some of our tributary areas, up in the headwaters, sort of in the eastern slopes of the province, but really keeping our wheels out of water. And so essentially what this means is that we always want to be using marked crossings whenever we come to a water body. We should never be taking quads on the bed and shore of a lake or anything like that. And so part of the reason why wheels out of water is so important, especially up in streams, is mostly actually for fish health. So what happens when our wheels go in the water is we stir up all of the dirt and the silt at the bottom, and if there's fish eggs that are in a red or a nest there, it can actually coat the eggs, resulting in the fish to die. And so not only is it disturbing also the riparian area, which we know has so many important health things that it does for our lakes and our rivers, but it can actually also be harming the species that are living in there as well. So at the end of the day, we just want to make sure, again, that we're using these marked crossings. If there is no marked crossing there, there are best practices that you can follow if you are still in need essentially of crossing the stream, which is basically to go at a 90-degree angle on gravel. So making sure you're not picking a soft spot. But really at the end of the day, the general rule is to always keep wheels out of water. So if we shift now to look more actually on the shoreline of the lake, so moving closer to the water, some of the activities that we often see, which can have implications in terms of our lake, is shoreline modification. So people putting in retaining walls, removing that riparian area, putting down a beach, so sand, or replacing it with lawn, and also doing aquatic plant removal. So both on the cattails essentially that are on the shoreline itself, and then aquatic plants down in the water. And so essentially with all of this stuff, again, we just want to leave it sort of as natural as possible. That's always what we tell people. If you can leave it and let it be free and let it do what it's supposed to be doing, that's what will have the most impact on the health of the lake. So another issue, of course, is pet and human waste. So pet might be, or it might sound like a bit of a weird one to you, but if you've heard of some of the fecal coliform warnings that have come out around lakes, that often is not actually from human waste, it is from animal waste. So things like birds that are in the area. And so when we have cattle waste and we have dog waste, all going into the water, that contains pathogens essentially that can lead to some of those fecal coliform notifications. So we just want to make sure again that we're picking up all of our waste. And then if we have issues around our sewage systems, that's another big problem with lakes. So in terms of what we see because of this, of course, is that damaged riparian area. And the riparian area, having it intact and healthy, is going to be one of the most important things that we can do for our lake. And if we're removing aquatic plants as well, that means there's less macrophytes or less of those big plants to actually sort of suck up the nutrients. So the more plants that we have, the better in terms of algae growth and things like that, because they're going to be using up and sort of occupying some of the nutrients that are in the water. The other thing to think about too, again, is that faster flowing water will always carry more stuff. So it's going to pick up more nutrients. It doesn't have the time to soak into the water and let those cattails sort of soak up the nutrients and things like that. So the more sort of clear pathway that we create for water to get into the lake from our homes, that can have a really big impact as well. So even things like changing your downspout from your house so that it's pointing away from the lake can help to slow the water down as well. So what can we do to help? Always, again, have that natural shoreline. So we're not necessarily saying that you can't have a lawn because we know it's all about spending time at the lake and enjoying the space that you have. But the best thing that you can do is to leave that buffer. So here in this photo, we can see it's a great example. You can see they have a lawn behind there, but they've left quite a big strip here of the natural vegetation. And so that's really, again, one of the best things that we can do for the health of our lake, and also making sure that we're not plowing or adding sand to our beach. So often when people add sand to their beach, it actually will get swept away. And so that's just a big old waste of money that we don't want you to have to go through. But erosion can be quite a problem if you're trying to add sand to your beach. So if you would like to have sort of a sandy spot, it's actually recommended that you move that above the high water mark. So away from the water a little bit. And then again, like we said before, pick up your pet waste. In terms of your septic system, always have it inspected and emptied as recommended. Septic Sense is also actually turning their workshops online as well. So they actually have 2 coming up in September. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested in learning more about managing your septic tanks. That's a really great program that provides lots of information as well. So they've also shifted from running sort of in-person workshops to running online workshops as well. So now moving into the water, this is where we'll talk a lot about our recreation. And so as mentioned before, aquatic plant removal can be an activity that is quite common. So especially when you're talking about plants floating around in the water, I wonder where those plants came from. So we have had that happen at other lakes before, where basically we get mats of floating vegetation, and it's from people who have cut aquatic vegetation, and then it essentially floats out into the lake and forms mats. So that could be one source of that. But also boating, fishing, and swimming. So lots of people love to spend time at the lake, as we know, as all of you do as well. But so this means, of course, that we've got lots of people coming to visit. And some of the implications for that Again, so less macrophytes sucking up those nutrients, which can lead to more blue-green algae. We can also see lots of wave damage from boating, particularly with the wake boats that are so common these days for wake surfing. They have a huge wake that they produce when they're going so slow. With people coming and going, we've got the threat of aquatic invasive species. And then with people fishing, not only during the summer, but also during the winter, we have our ice fishing hut removal issues. So people not taking their ice fishing hut off before the end of the season. So what can we do to help mitigate all of the issues that we see from our activity when we like to come into the water? So one of the most important things, again, is we just need that vegetation. And so you can see in this photo here, people have actually cut strips or lanes around their docks to allow for boats to come and go from the docks. And so rather than cutting very wide lanes or cutting more than what you would actually need, this is what we prefer to see, is very small sections that have been removed. But before you remove anything, of course, you need to get approval first. So that is something that you require approval from Alberta Environment and Parks to do at this time. And so important to just keep in mind that if you are going to be removing any aquatic vegetation, that you do need to seek our approval before doing that. So this brings us to our invasive species. And so I see Chelsea has a question of, do we have lots of invasive species reported in Alberta lakes this year? Thankfully, we do not, but we do have a lot of boats that have come in through our inspection stations that actually have mussels attached. So this is where I ask you to give us a hand while you're out at the lake. And if you don't have a dock, you can still participate in this. This is a campaign that we've run sort of every September for our shoreline owners. And that is essentially that while you are removing this big long dock out of the water, that we want you to check it for attached mussels. And so the reason for this is because not only are we always on the lookout for invasive species, but we also need you to be on the lookout as well. And so we've got two mussel species that we are looking for. Hopefully you've heard of them before, but they're zebra and quagga mussels. And they attach themselves onto any hard surface. So while you're removing your dock, it's actually a great place to be able to check and see, especially if it has metal components on it or plastic components on it, if there's any attached organisms to it, essentially. And so if you find anything, even if you're not sure what it is, we'd like you to report it. And so we have two options for that, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but we have our 24-hour hotline, and then we have EdMaps, which is either an app on your phone or you can do it through the website. But in terms of what you're actually looking for, we've got some great comparisons here, because we do actually have native mussels in Alberta, but they will be buried in the sand. So they won't actually be attached to anything, and they're quite a bit larger. So zebra and quagga mussels are very small, and like I said, they're always attached to a hard surface. And then on the photo on the right, you can really see the comparison in shape of the shell as well. So mussels that are invasive often have sort of a D shape, like a capital D, whereas the native mussels will be more round. And so the concern with mussels coming into the province, like I said, if you haven't heard of them before, essentially is that we know that we have enough calcium in our lakes to support populations of them. Our lakes often are very similar in characteristics to Lake Winnipeg, where there is an established zebra mussel population. And as you can see on this stick here, where they've just completely globbed onto it, in terms of our water infrastructure, especially in southern Alberta, that's where we're really concerned about these potentially getting into irrigation districts. So because they just attach onto any hard surface, it's estimated right now that it would cost us about $75 million a year in replacing damaged equipment, whether that be from your boat to your dock to any pipes that are moving water from one location to another. And then also just their implications for the ecosystem as well. So because they're filter feeders, they're going to remove that bottom level of the food chain, which means that all of our small organisms will be removed, which essentially can create a food chain collapse so that we don't have fish populations left. And as you know, lots of fishermen in Alberta who love to go out and visit our lakes. So lots of really big implications for mussels trying to sneak their way in. But thankfully, not only are you guys hopefully on the lookout for them, but so are we. So we do have watercraft inspection stations that are set up along the edge of the province that are looking for boats that are coming in all the time. And so this year so far, we've actually had 16 boats that we've had recorded that have had mussels attached to them. So that's actually getting close to our highest number ever. which again, with the pandemic and knowing that people are moving around across Canada a lot more than normal is not necessarily surprising, but it is still really concerning. So it's not just our folks who are trained, our staff that look for the mussels, but it's also some of our dogs as well. So we have 3 canines that are trained to help sniff out the mussels. So this is Diesel here. He actually found one of the boats this year that had mussels attached to it. So we have Diesel, Hilo, and Zeus. So 3 canine conservation dogs that go out and check the boats for us as well. So it's a lot quicker for them to do it. As you can imagine, it can be really hard to see essentially some of the mussels when they're so small. And so Chelsea's asking if I can tell you where the boats with the mussels are coming from. So the majority of them are all from Eastern Canada. So initially when the program started, we were really focused on the States because that's where so many of the mussels are. And we thought that the snowbird population coming back from their winter holiday would be the main people moving mussels around, but the majority of them are actually coming from Ontario at this point. So both Ontario and then Lake Winnipeg. Since Lake Winnipeg has become infested, their infestation was found in October of 2013. That's really when we started seeing boats coming through that had live mussels attached to them. So the mussels can survive for 30 days outside of the water, attached onto the boat, depending on the temperature. Thankfully, our cold winters here in Alberta, if a boat came through during the winter and was parked outside, all of the mussels would die off. However, it's still obviously a really big concern for us. So our crews are still out there, social distancing, they've got their masks, they've got their PPE on, they're working hard to keep Alberta's lakes healthy and safe, but again, that's just why we ask other folks to help us too. So while you're out at the lake, again, if you're removing your dock, to just check all of the hard surfaces on it. And so it's not just mussels that we are checking for at our watercraft inspection stations either. They actually look for other invasives as well, one of which is Eurasian Watermilfoil. And so kind of interesting here because not only are we checking for boats and things like that as they're coming in, but we are also monitoring Alberta's lakes, which is mostly done in partnership with our good friends at ALMS, the Alberta Lake Management Society. And so ALMS has actually been doing testing of milfoil in Alberta. It was a new program that started last year and it's continued this year, which is really exciting, to test essentially the water milfoil that we have here, because there's 2 species that look really, really similar. Our native species, which is the northern water milfoil, and then the Eurasian, which is found in BC, but to this time, or to date, not found in Alberta yet. So there have been a few cases where they've tricked our experts, they haven't been able to identify it, and they've had to send it for genetic testing. So it's not necessarily easy to tell which one it is, and some of them look like they could be hybrids with other species, but to date, like I said, we haven't found any Eurasian water milfoil, but again, just something to keep your eye out while you're out and about in terms of some of our threats. So the resource that I have listed here is actually ALMS has just put out a 2nd edition of it. So it's a really great book, and it essentially has aquatic plants of Alberta, and it compares native and invasive plants. So it's set up essentially so that you can see lookalikes to invasives of common plants that you might see out at the lake. And so it's a really great resource. And like I said, they've just updated it. You can download it for free off of their website, or you can order a hard copy and buy it as well. So in terms of what other actions we can do, other than reporting as we're removing our docks for this year, of course, is to always clean, drain, dry our gear. And so this is a really big thing, not only just coming from out of province, but also actually while you are in Alberta. And so when we say clean, drain, dry your gear, it's actually quite simple. It's not necessarily that you are taking your boat to a car wash to soak it down with hot soapy water. We actually are just saying that we want to make sure that there's no water, no mud, and no plants. And so we also have a regulation that while you're transporting your boat, you have to remove the drain plug from it. And that's because we've got so many people showing up with essentially contaminated water in their boat. So we don't know where it's coming from, and we don't know if there could potentially be hidden things in it, like whirling disease or zebra mussel veligers. But we just want to make sure that we're always removing all of the water, all of the mud, and then all of the plants as well. And of course, if you're coming from outside of Alberta, then no mussels. So in terms of what we want people to do to clean, drain, dry, like we said, just essentially wipe it down, pull all of your plugs, empty out any standing water that could be in there, and remove any plant pieces, because we know plants like Eurasian Watermilfoil can start to reproduce from just a small fragment. So another important thing is don't let it loose. So really exciting for this campaign. We had it in Alberta for quite a while, but it has now actually gone national. So the federal government has accepted it along with all of the other provinces, and they've come up with these fancy new logos, which is really exciting to see sort of the reach of this campaign moving on. But really it's a problem of people moving live organisms from one place to another. So on the screen here, these are examples of things that have been found in Alberta. So looking on the left, we actually have a Chinese mystery snail. So this is a new one that was found down in McGregor Lake. And our crews were actually down there this week doing some sampling of it. But essentially what makes it unique is that it gives live birth. And so snails often usually lay eggs, but these retain the eggs inside of them and then give live birth to their babies, which can increase their survival. And they also have an operculum that they can close their shell up. So if we were ever to try and do a treatment to get rid of them, all they would do is close their shell up and kind of go into hibernation and then wait until all the chemicals went away and then come back out of their shell. So it makes it really hard for control of them. But they are so far localized just to a small component of Lake McGregor. So we're doing lots of education around it in the area, and then also doing some monitoring to see how far they are actually spread. And then this little guy here is a black bullhead. So up in Fort McMurray at a Texaco East trout pond, somebody released this fish. So we have no idea how they got it there. Literally what we can think of is that they had an aquarium in their car that they drove this fish from. If you've ever heard of noodling before, it is a type of fishing that is quite popular in the States, where you take your hand and you put it in the catfish's mouth and you wiggle your fingers around in order for it to grab onto your hand. And so this is a fish that does that. Unfortunately, in the trout pond that it was in, we had to shut the pond down. And we had to do a treatment to get rid of them. And so kids lost out on a fishing opportunity for 2 years before they were able to confirm that there are no black bullhead left there. So just another story of people moving fish around when they really shouldn't be. So not an ideal situation. And then last but not least, we have our two favorites, the Prussian carp and goldfish or koi. So Prussian carp are essentially a wild goldfish, and they interbreed with goldfish to the point that you can't necessarily tell them apart. And it can be really tricky because when goldfish breed out in the wild, they often actually lose their orange color. And so particularly in southern Alberta, this is a really big problem. To date, we've had a few reports of it around Edmonton actually this year, which are new, that are still under investigation. But in terms of goldfish populations, we have more than 50 of them across the province. And so really big issue with the goldfish essentially is that they're just completely taking over the habitats that they're getting put into. So as you can see, this little fish here is from St. Albert. And so this boy was out fishing with his grandpa using hot dogs for bait, and he just reeled in this whopper of a koi fish. And so you can see just how big it's gotten. When St. Albert has done treatments there in the past, they've removed 45,000 fish. So they just breed like crazy. And this is all from people physically dumping their aquariums. So we do a lot of education for folks to remind them to make sure not to dump any unwanted pets. And so we've had other reports of other fish species being sold in the province as well that are illegal in pet stores. So it's kind of both on the pet store in order to ensure that they're only bringing in species that are actually legal to sell in Alberta, but then also on the pet owner to make sure that if they don't want their pet anymore, to take it back to the pet store or give it to a friend. So don't let it loose, really important thing. You would think that it's probably common sense for lots of people, but if you knew the amount of populations of goldfish that we have in the province and the number of reports of new ones that we're still continuing to get, even after all of the media coverage, it's pretty crazy. So animals aren't the only problem though. We also have plants that are an issue. So if you've heard of flowering rush before, it is the plant that is completely taking over Lake Isle. It grows to about 4 meters in depth. So it can essentially fill up our entire shorelines, so thick to the point that you can actually walk on it. And so that's what's happening out at Lake Isle. This photo is from there. But it's an ornamental plant that was initially brought in because of this beautiful pink umbrella flower that it has. So we do have a lot of populations of it across the province now, especially in southern Alberta. It is in the Bow River, so along the South Saskatchewan River Basin. They had done a GPS mapping project there, and there was over 5,000 points of it along the river. So lots of it down there. The key thing, of course, is that when you are buying plant species, please make sure that they are native. We actually found flowering rush in 2018 being sold in a large retailer store. There's an agricultural fieldman who was out shopping with his family, and he saw it and flagged it for us, and we had it removed from the shelves immediately. But unfortunately, some things still do sneak through. So our friends at the Alberta Invasive Species Council have a great program called PlantWise and Grow Me Instead. So it essentially has a photo of the invasive plants and then other plants that you can plant that have a similar look to it. So if you really want to have this bright pink umbrella flower, what can you have that's almost the same but isn't invasive or illegal? So that, of course, brings us to EdMap. So I had mentioned this earlier before, but this is really a cool citizen science project that anybody can take part in. And essentially what it is it's an app that you can download on your phone, or you can go onto their website and you can report your data. And so the cool thing about EdMaps too is that you'll see it's not just Alberta who's using it. There's lots of other jurisdictions, but we actually upload all of our maps into EdMaps as well. So if you want to see when your lake was last monitored for zebra mussels, you can actually go and see the results that are in there. So it reports not only positives, but also negatives. So if you are out there and removing your dock this year and you see that there's no mussels, you can actually report that too. And so that can help us as we move forward in terms of collecting data to know if there ever was an infestation. We could say, oh, somebody had reported in 2020, the fall of 2020, that there were no mussels there. So it can narrow down the time frame in terms of when the infestation happened. So to help with reporting, we do have this handy invasive species pocket guide, which talks about the 52 prohibited species that are out there that you can report through EdMaps. So you can use this to help identify it, though, even if you're not sure, if you see something that looks a little strange, if you don't know what the species is, I would encourage you to still submit a report because all of the data that gets put into EdMaps gets verified by an expert. So even if it's not the organism that you're looking for, that's totally fine because they will just sort of get rid of your submission if it's not actually an invasive species. So other things to be aware of while we're out recreating in the water, of course, watch your wake. So there is actually a federal law that says that we need to go 10 kilometers under 10 kilometers per hour when you're within 30 meters of the shoreline. There's lots of sort of caveats with that. So if you're pulling a skier, then it doesn't apply. But in general, we really need to be making sure that we are not producing large wakes as we go along the shoreline. And so that's, of course, for species like our western grebe, where they nest along the shoreline, and then these big waves come crashing in and can wreck their nests. So always important, as you can see here in this photo, they're out in the middle of the lake. You can see just how big their wake is, but they are doing sort of the best practice by being out in the middle of the lake and not anywhere near the shoreline. So when it comes to responsible angling, of course, always knowing and following our regulations, but something cool that's kind of happened in the angling world is that there's a keep fish wet movement. And so this is a really big thing in the States right now. And it's encouraging anglers to actually learn how to take photos of their fish in order to increase the fish's survival, but also just general handling techniques as well. So there's been lots of studies that have come out that have shown that fish that are held out of the water for a long period of time will actually have a much a decreased chance of surviving a catch and release fishing situation. So if we can hold them in the water for as long as possible, keep them wet as much as possible, that actually highly increases their chance of survival. And so this year our department launched our Go Fish initiative. So if you're looking for something to do for the rest of summer, it's actually open until October 31st. And it's essentially a bingo game that you can play, or you can do it online as well if you don't want to play bingo. But there's a series of challenges that you can take, and those challenges will help you become a more responsible angler. So you can learn more about our Keep Fish Wet movement, or you can learn more about the regulations and how they actually make the regulations. But if you just Google Go Fish, then you'll see there's a whole website set up that actually sort of acts as a landing page for this program with lots of really interesting responsible angling tips and tricks. So of course, with fishing comes the ice fishing hut removal. And so this has, again, been a problem at lakes for many, many years. So we do have a stewardship program that our counties and summer villages actually do a really great job of organizing and running it. So it's the Take It Off program. And so often it's a voluntary registration to register your ice fishing hut so that they can contact you if it still isn't taken off by the end of the year. But that being said, we do actually have an engagement opportunity right now that actually has something about ice fishing huts in it. So the engagement that is open right now around this is actually around the fishing regulations survey. So it's not the sport fishing regulations that say how big of a fish you can keep or how many fish you can keep. It's more about the actual legislation that creates those sport fishing regulations. So there's questions in there about crayfish, about ice fishing huts, and just soliciting feedback sort of on some of the management changes around that. So I'd encourage you to go and fill out the survey. It's open until September 1st. And like I said, it's kind of a, when you first go in, there's like, it seems like it's a very random series of questions because it is just about the fisheries regulation in general. But the engagement page explains all of that. So again, I would encourage you to go and fill that out. So last but not least, in terms of our recreation in the water, of course, is blue-green algae. And so blue-green algae is something that comes up every single year at lakes. It's always comes up in the news as being a really big issue. Unfortunately, this year there was a dog in Moose Lake, if you guys heard about that passed away from blue-green algae. And so some of the issues around blue-green algae really are that it's not an invasive species. Often people think that it is an invasive species, but it's actually natural in Alberta, and it is actually detected in most lakes. So the only time that it becomes an issue is when we start to have a bloom. And so a bloom, of course, being when we just have a ton of algal growth. And so with that, there's actually lots of different species of blue-green algae, and only some of them produce toxins. And the toxicity is temporary. So it's really hard to tell if a bloom is toxic or not, which is why our friends over at Alberta Health Services put notifications on when there is blue-green algae. So it can be really hard to tell. Like I said, just by looking at a bloom, you can't tell if it's toxic or not, which is why we always just recommend that people avoid them at all costs. And so when we're looking at blooms, like I said, because there's so many different species of them, they can look very different as well. So this makes it really hard to educate people about what to be watching out for. But really anything that has algae that's sort of floating within the water column, quite often it will get blown up onto shore, I'm sure, as you guys all know. But there's just so many different factors that play into blue-green algae. And whether or not we'll have a bloom and whether or not that bloom will be toxic. So just something to keep in mind that, again, like it is natural to Alberta. It's found in all of our lakes pretty much for the most part. It's only when it starts to increase in level to the point that it's at a bloom that it becomes a problem. So what can we do for blue-green algae? The most important thing, like I said, is just to avoid it. And so you can still use the lake in areas where there isn't a bloom. Quite often, like I said, it'll get blown up into shore, or it'll be within a bay of a specific area of a lake. So it's still totally fine to use the lake in other places. Just recognizing that you need to be really careful to make sure that you're not swimming in a bloom or anything like that. And so if you do come in contact with it, wash it off as quickly as possible and call HealthLink if you have any concerns. And so this year as well, you might have heard on the news, Dr. Hinshaw had talked very early on during the pandemic about how lake monitoring would be a bit different this year, especially for blue-green algae. And the reason for that is because the test that they use for COVID is a qPCR test, and it's actually the same method in the lab that they use for blue-green algae. So they are up and running in terms of testing now. They were a little bit behind this year, so it's monitoring started in July through the Safe Beach Protocol. But just again, it was a bit of a shift in terms of of when they were able to actually get the testing running. And so, like I said, it is up and running now, but also if you are out and about, you can actually report potential blooms as well. So keep that in mind. Yeah, so I think with that, we'll go to our last poll. So I've kind of thrown lots of information out at you tonight. But what we want to know is what actions will you take after tonight to help maintain or improve the health of your lake? So these are probably things that lots of you are already doing as stewards of the watersheds. But we'd just like to hear what are some of the things that you can take action on to help the health of our lake. So this one too is also a multiple choice. So you can choose more than one if you are interested. Oh, and I see Michael added an option to use the chat too.
It's not letting you choose more than one.
Oh, it's not? Oh, well, that's okay. Pick your top action. Chelsea says the EdMaps app is great. Yeah, I love it too. It's very, very user-friendly.
All right, so I'm gonna close the poll in 10 seconds.
Countdown is on.
I'll maybe take those 10 seconds to mention the link that I put in the chat that's about the Western Grebe Recovery Plan.
Oh, perfect.
I mentioned Lecklebush has a Western Grebe connection. It's one of the few lakes in Alberta that has a significant Western Grebe population, and that species is a threatened species.
Excellent.
All right, so we are sharing the results with the poll.
Perfect. All right, so I see, yeah, lots of people downloading EdMaps on your smartphone, which is great. You can use that to report your hopeful lack of mussels on your dock, planting native species, keeping livestock out of water, talk to your friend about what I've learned. Awesome. So pretty much everything that we've gone through tonight in terms of actions that you can take is actually part of the Respect Our Lakes program. And so we do have lots of resources that are available. We've been continually updating sort of our brochures that we have available for folks and coming up with new brochures based on key issues. So we added this agricultural around Alberta lakes this year, which is a new one because that was identified as an issue that lots of folks were dealing with. But we have lots of other materials as well. And so it's not just the Respect Our Lakes program that's out there, of course. There's so many other great organizations. And we actually have an infographic that can help point you towards all the other great organizations. And so you can download this from the Respect Our Lakes website. But it just talks about the roles of different organizations around lakes. And so again, we know that there's so many folks out there who are working to help the health of our lake. And the more that we can work together, the better. And so we created this infographic to try and really paint that picture of who's doing what in the lake world, because there is so much going on, and how can we work together to do that. So another exciting opportunity is our friends at Alms, who normally host a conference in the fall, have shifted it online, of course, with our current situation. And so it's going to be every Friday for the morning of September. Brad has got a great lineup of speakers who are going to be talking to us about a whole slew of issues around lakes. So he's got the first session is actually going to be focused on Alberta, and then the rest of them are going to have speakers from outside of Alberta. So talking about issues that are still relevant, but sharing their experience. So make sure to sign up for that. It's totally free. All you have to do is register, and then you'll get a Zoom link, so similar to tonight. But we'll be carrying on the conversation of lake education and stewardship there. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
So I just wanted to mention we did have some questions in the chat that hadn't got covered yet. So so we do have some people that have armored their shorelines with riprap, or sometimes you see in other lakes with cement walls. So what are your thoughts on that?
So that's sort of the last method that AEP recommends. So we're actually working on another fact sheet that we have right now that our lands approval staff currently use. It's quite out of date, but it just talks about different options. So in terms of Riprap, if we are going to be using riprap, we want to be using vegetated riprap. And in most situations, things like retaining walls really is our last option, like I said. So that is what we would call hard armoring. And so we tend to try and push people towards soft armoring. So there may be cases where your erosion factor is really high, that it might be recommended to have a hard armoring situation, but for the most part, we really do recommend the soft armoring. And any changes to the shoreline is going to need approval. So you're going to have to go through our folks in the approvals office in order to do that, and they'll help guide you through that process. So yeah, I would strongly recommend soft armoring. Just as an example, out at Wabamun Lake, when they had the ice quake event a couple of years ago, the folks who had natural shorelines were much better off than the folks who had any of the retaining walls or things like that. So it's an example of how much better our natural shorelines can do in an event like that.
And so what do you mean by soft armoring?
So soft armoring or putting things like willow down. If you are having erosion issues, essentially, that's generally where we start to do any of those projects where you're putting in retaining walls and things like that. So yeah, soft armoring basically is anything that's going to be natural vegetation. So lots of cattails, all the good plants out there. Great.
There's a question too. Where could somebody get their hands on that invasive species pocketbook?
So we can send them to you. If you want to just send me an email, I can pop one in the mail to you, or we can send you guys a bunch as well to the organization if you're interested in helping distribute them.
That's great. I see your email is right there on the slide. So
you betcha.
If you're interested in that, just jot that down. Also a question here, are shorelines and riparian areas federal or provincial jurisdiction, and are there fines for changing the areas?
That is a great question. So that's not, lake legislation is one of the hardest things to understand. And so essentially where private land and public land or crown land ends is at the ordinary high water mark. And so that is where we see a shift essentially from aquatic vegetation to upland vegetation. So that is actually determined under the Surveyors Act, which is Alberta. So where the bank is under the Surveyors Act, and then beyond that, it depends on what you're doing, but the shoreline itself is going to be crown land. So the bed and shore, the land that's underneath it. What starts to happen when we get out into the water, depending on the water body that you're on, there is some federal jurisdiction that applies to it. But in terms of shoreline modifications, for the most part, it is going to be provincial jurisdiction under the Water Act and the Public Lands Act. And there potentially could be big fines for changing the area if you don't have approval beforehand. So essentially, if you're planning on doing any shoreline work, we really want you to reach out to our approval staff beforehand. I almost guaranteed that you're going to need a Water Act approval, and depending on the work that you're doing, you might also need a Public Lands Act approval as well. And they can help walk you through that process. It is an online process now for the Water Act. So they have a system called One Stop that they use now, which is supposed to help speed up the process. But yeah, like I said, it's not an easy thing to try and wade your way through per se, but the best thing to do is to call one of our officers. Particularly our lands officers have lots of great insight that they can provide if you're looking to start a shoreline project. And then if you see work that's happening that doesn't have an approval, or that looks like they're going beyond the ordinary high water mark, then we want you to give our environmental hotline a call. And so that number can be found on our website, but it's basically to report environmental emergencies.
And I think under the Fisheries Act, the riparian areas are considered fish habitat, even though you don't see fish crawling up in there. It is technically fish habitat.
Yeah, and that's where federal jurisdiction can get involved as well with the Federal Fisheries Act. So depending on, again, on the water body that you're on. So it varies very much per lake, but in general, yeah, bed and shore, province, upland, but if you're doing anything in the upland that affects the water quality or quantity or bed and shore, then you still need approval. So.
Yeah. All right. So is there any, next question I have here, is there any legislation that can use to control cattle watering along the lake?
Oh, that's a great question. I would guess that it could be under the Water Act, because the cattle themselves would be changing the water quality when they're in it. But I am not sure if that has ever actually been used before as an issue. So for the most part, we just focus on stewardship. But that could be something that I could look into for more information if there's ever been any compliance cases around it.
Yeah, I could think that would be a Fisheries Act issue too, potentially, the federal.
Yeah.
All right. So there's a comment here that the green infrastructure would also include minimizing impervious surfaces. So I think Janine, you had talked about that with like things like roads and driveways and even rooftops are all impervious surfaces. And that is a main theme from the Alberta Low Impact Development Partnership. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, ALIDP has lots of really great resources as well in terms of if you're looking to do specific projects on your property, just, yeah, focusing on that low impact development basically. So what can we do to slow down the water and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, one thing I would love to see to slow down the water in our county is just to have more of our ditches naturally vegetated versus mowed. So those that are on council who are listening.
That's a nice little plug there.
Yeah.
I see Councillor Kachuk has left us already, but
yeah,
Mr. Mayor Mugrabi is still with us.
Yes. All right. So is there anybody else that has any questions? If you want to just unmute yourself with your space bar or by clicking on that blue button on your picture, you can do that now, or again, last chance here for typing something into the chat.
So I'll respond to the cutting of the grass if you want, Michael.
Putting you on the spot.
No, so some of those are provincial highways, which they will cut. Right now, the way they do it right now with their funding is about once a year. There's also a safety factor in terms of what comes out of the ditch, which is a lot of wildlife. The other one is a lot of our roads are fairly GMSS standards, which are quite wide. Usually we'll try to have a sort of a stormwater with them, even though it's difficult when you're that large and you've got 1,600 kilometers of roads. Actually all the roads we built, or the provincial roads, probably contributed to the flooding that we had in Lac-La-Biche. I've been here all my life and commercial fished the lakes and been on the lakes. We've had about 3 years of a wet season, so there is a lot of water. Beavers are also starting to affect some of our inlets and some of the flooding. So, we used to be part of the balance of nature. Now we're maybe on the other side of it.
Yeah, Cows and Fish has put together some really great resources around beavers with the Mustakis Institute. They were running like workshops specific to living with beavers. So you guys aren't the only ones.
Omer, I might, I'll float an idea here that just came to mind when you were describing about the ditches and that they're provincial highways. So this year, of course, with lots of water, I often bike out to the golf course and back. And so there's long stretches that I noticed this summer where the ditches were being mowed, but not in the bottom of the ditch because there was standing water, and any of the vehicles, the mowers, weren't able to drive through there without getting stuck in mud. And the idea that comes to mind is, well, I wonder if we could propose that that could be kind of practice from now on, so that they would mow the upper parts of the ditch. Obviously, that would cover what's directly adjacent to the shoulders, but not mow the deepest parts, and that would leave vegetation in the bottoms of the ditches. That would be a bit of maybe a compromise.
Yeah, that is one of the things. If you've noticed, even some of our farms and we live on the divide. Obviously, it either goes one way or the other. But the water was the grounds were so saturated. It was like walking in a swamp, in muskeg.
Mm-hmm.
And we had, we've had maybe a week or so of hot weather, but that's still. For example, the farmers can only get into so many of their fields, a percentage of the fields. But when you're saying, yes, I think your comment, Brian, is, we can't get the machinery down into the lower part of the ditches. And they'll probably, you'll see it dry up a bit, but we get snow in September, so it's going to be full of snow pretty quick.
It's a very, very high water year this year, that's for sure.
Yeah. If you guys want to know how I feel about ditches, you should come drive by Young's Beach and guess which is my house. I'm the only house that has 2-meter tall cattails and bulrushes growing in my ditch. So.
I just wanted to say thanks, Janine, for presenting. It was a really good presentation and interesting, and I really appreciated it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. It's always exciting to get out and chat with people, even if it's from our homes.
I'd like to comment on Michael's there. I think there was a number of people that had water issues in Young's Beach, we'll call it, or Young's. So that's just because of the water runoff from it's going on the Beaver River shed side and from the farm.
Mm. Yeah, we had big flooding of basements and stuff like that going on this year. At least not in my house, but elsewhere, thankfully. All right, well, I think that's probably going to be it then for questions, unless anybody else is going to throw anything in last minute here. But yeah, as Chelsea mentioned, I really want to express my gratitude to you, Janine, for doing this for us. I found a very informative presentation. I got a bunch of notes here that a couple of things that I'm going to check out, and I hope other people do too. And
Michael,
yes, sir.
I just wanted to comment on something, if I can, here.
Sure.
On when she first started off. We had been working for about 30 years to get the fishing, and I knew the fishing regs would be high. We have over 150 bodies of water, and one of our issues is that if we have problems with the birds, also the cormorants. So we'll be working with Minister Nixon and that department starting now to see what we could do for next year, because we consider ourselves Alberta's playground, because it's affordable, it's right here. A lot of it is in natural state, and we do have some large fish, I can tell you that.
Yeah, and every year they do review like the sport fishing regulations themselves. So our engagement usually comes out in January for that. So always keep an eye out for that. It's something that happens essentially every year. And yeah, Minister Nixon is very focused on fish. So lots of opportunity around the fisheries world and how they make their decisions and what that looks like. So
we have a lake called Touchwood Lake, and I don't know if you know it, but Michael, you know it. It's close to 200 feet deep.
Wow.
It hasn't been open for 30 years. And we used to commercial fish, and there's big fish in that lake, I can tell you. But it's if you're fishing with hook, you got to watch how deep you're pulling them out, because they got to be slow, and you got to put them back in slowly to survive.
Yeah.
So we're working on all kinds of things.
It's an exciting time.
All right. Well, great. Thank you for those comments, Mayor. And yeah, again, guys, if you want to make sure you put into your calendars our next couple of sessions that we're going to be doing. September 3rd is the Lac La Biche Overview of Scientific Studies. September 17th is the Planning for Healthy Lakes. And of course, most importantly, October 1st, what I'll be doing on what is a wetland. All right, so thanks again, Janine. Thank you everybody who took some time off their evening to come and join us. We will be posting this up on YouTube. We're just getting that set up right now, but it's in process. So really glad to be able to go back to these and review them or see ones that we might have missed. So that's great.
Thanks, Janine.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Everybody enjoy your evening. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight.
You as well.
Good.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.